Isabella gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, the gleaming mansion looming before her like a beautiful trap. Her husband Andrew sat beside her, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her chest. "It's just a family dinner, my love," Andrew said with that innocent smile that had once melted her heart. Now it only reminded her of his blindness to his mother's machinations. "Yes," Isabella whispered, "just dinner." The mansion's lights blazed through ornate windows, casting golden squares onto the immaculate lawn. Mrs. Margareth had spent a fortune on landscape architects. Isabella's fortune, though nobody but she knew it. Not even Andrew. "You look beautiful tonight," Andrew squeezed her hand. "Mother will be impressed." Isabella bit back a bitter laugh. No matter how she dressed, spoke, or succeeded, Mrs. Margareth would never approve. 7 years of marriage had taught her this painful truth. A uniformed maid opened the heavy oak door. Isabella's heels clicked against imported marble as she entered the lion's den, her crimson dress a battle flag against the muted beiges and creams Mrs. Margareth preferred. "Mi hijo," Mrs. Margareth exclaimed, arms outstretched for Andrew. She embraced him as though he'd returned from war, not from the home he shared with Isabella 3 miles away. When she finally acknowledged Isabella, Mrs. Margareth's smile remained frozen, her eyes cold as winter glass. "And Isabella, still with us?" "Still here," Isabella confirmed, meeting her gaze with equal frost. The dining room gleamed with crystal and silver. Candelabras cast dramatic shadows across the table, where Mrs. Margareth presided like a queen, Andrew at her right hand. Isabella sat across, isolated. "The wine is exquisite," Mrs. Margareth declared after the first course. "From the vineyard I told you about, Andrew. The one I suggested for your anniversary trip. Though I imagine Isabella prefers something sweeter." The implication hung in the air that Isabella lacked sophistication, that she was common. Actually, Isabella sipped the Bordeaux with practiced elegance. "I find this particular vintage has remarkable depth. I visited the chateau last spring during my business trip to France." Mrs. Margareth's smile tightened. "Business, always business with you. I worry about Andrew, home alone so often while you... What is it you do again? Something with investments." "Mother," Andrew began weakly. Isabella cut him off with a gentle touch. "I manage portfolios for high net worth individuals. Some people find financial independence quite attractive." The servants brought the main course, tender lamb with truffle sauce, while tensions simmered beneath polite conversation. Mrs. Margareth steered every topic toward Isabella's failings, her busy schedule, her decision to postpone children, her independent nature. Andrew was raised to appreciate tradition, Mrs. Margareth said, cutting precisely into her lamb. "A wife who nurtures her home, children who carry the family name, it's what makes a house warm. And what makes a marriage work is mutual respect," Isabella countered. "Wouldn't you agree, Mrs. Margareth?" Before she could respond, Mrs. Margareth's phone chimed. She glanced at it with annoyance, then excused herself. Isabella caught a glimpse of the screen, a notification from her banking app. When she returned, Mrs. Margareth's complexion had paled slightly beneath her perfect makeup. "Is everything all right, Mother?" Andrew asked. "Fine, darling. Just business." Her voice caught on the last word, eyes flicking to Isabella. "Your father always handled such matters." Isabella felt a flicker of satisfaction. The monthly transfer must have arrived. The one that kept this mansion running. The staff paid. The appearances maintained. The one Mrs. Margareth believed came from her late husband's investments, managed by the family banker. "I was saying," Mrs. Margareth continued, composure regained, "it's good to see you're still here, Isabella. I always thought women like you, well, have an expiration date." Andrew choked on his wine. Isabella's smile could have frozen flame. "And I always thought respect shouldn't expire after your son's wedding." The room crackled with electricity. Mrs. Margareth's eyes narrowed as she raised her crystal glass. To family, she toasted, voice dripping with insincerity, and to those who managed to stay in it, for now. Isabella raised her glass, heart pounding. To truth, she countered, it always finds its way to the surface. As the dessert plates were cleared, Mrs. Margareth leaned forward, her diamond necklace catching the candlelight. I was speaking with Elena yesterday. You remember her daughter Victoria, the doctor. Such a brilliant girl and still makes time for family. She turned to Andrew. She always asked about you, even after your engagement. Such a shame. Some matches are just meant to be. Isabella felt something snap inside her. 7 years of veiled insults, of poisonous suggestions, of watching Andrew shrink before his mother. What exactly are you implying, Mrs. Margareth? Isabella's voice was deadly quiet. Andrew reached for her hand under the table, a silent plea for peace. But it was too late. The battle lines had been drawn, and Isabella knew. This dinner would end differently than all the others before it. The crystalline sound of Mrs. Margareth's spoon tapping against her dessert plate pierced the silence like a needle. Isabella's challenge hung in the air, transforming the lavish dining room into a battlefield where every glance was a bullet, every word a sword. Implying, Mrs. Margareth's perfectly painted lips curved into a smile that never reached her eyes. I'm simply concerned for my son's happiness. Is that so terrible, to want the best for one's child? Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his chair, trapped between the two women who defined his life. Mother, please. Isabella makes me very happy. Of course she does, mihijo. Mrs. Margareth's voice dripped with honey-coated venom. But happiness comes in many forms. Security, loyalty, family. Her gaze slid to Isabella. Tradition. Isabella's spine straightened as if steel had replaced each vertebra. 7 years of these dinners. 7 years of subtle cuts designed to make her bleed without leaving visible wounds. And what tradition would that be, Mrs. Margareth? The one where women sacrifice their identities to become extensions of their husbands. Isabella sipped her wine, maintaining the facade of civility while battle raged beneath. You modern women with your careers and independence. Mrs. Margareth waved her hand dismissively, diamonds flashing on her fingers. Diamonds Isabella had secretly paid for through the family trust account. You mistake ambition for fulfillment. In my day, we understood what truly mattered. And what's that? Isabella asked, though she already knew the answer. Family loyalty. Mrs. Margareth's eyes hardened. Something that seems in short supply these days. The maid appeared, silent as a ghost, refilling wine glasses and clearing dessert plates. In that momentary interruption, Isabella caught Andrew's pleading expression. He wanted peace, had always wanted peace, but had never understood that his mother's war would accept nothing less than Isabella's complete surrender. When they were alone again, Mrs. Margareth leaned forward, her posture regal in her high-backed chair. I've seen it happen in the best families, you know? Women who marry into wealth, thinking they've secured their future. Her voice lowered conspiratorially. Gold diggers, we called them in my time. Though I suppose you'd prefer strategic partners now. Andrew's face flushed with embarrassment. Mother, that's enough. But Mrs. Margareth continued as if he hadn't spoken. Money can buy many things, dear, but class and loyalty, that you either have or you don't. Isabella met her gaze unflinchingly. I couldn't agree more. And some people never had it to begin with. The chandelier light caught the flash of rage in Mrs. Margareth's eyes before she masked it with another brittle smile. Andrew works so hard to provide this lifestyle for you. His father would be proud of how he's taken care of everyone. Isabella's laugh, a short, sharp sound, surprised even herself. Is that what you think is happening here? Isabella, Andrew warned, his voice tight with anxiety. What else would be happening? Mrs. Margareth's confidence never wavered. My son follows his father's footsteps, providing for his family. maintaining our standard of living. While you, she gestured vaguely at Isabella, enjoy the fruits of his labor. Andrew looked down at his plate, his silence a betrayal that cut deeper than any of his mother's barbs. He knew the truth, that Isabella's investment firm had flourished while his own architectural practice struggled, that their home, their lifestyle, and even his mother's mansion were maintained by Isabella's success. Yet he remained silent, trapped in the narrative his mother had woven. Life has been very good to you, Mrs. Margareth continued, triumph gleaming in her eyes. I don't know what you would do without my son supporting you. The room seemed to still, as if the universe itself held its breath. This was the moment. The line crossed, the point of no return. Isabella felt a strange calm settle over her, like the eye of a hurricane. Funny, Isabella replied, her voice soft but edged with steel as she locked eyes with her mother-in-law. I was just wondering what you would do without me. Confusion flickered across Mrs. Margareth's face, the first genuine emotion Isabella had seen all evening. What could you possibly mean by that? Isabella's smile was enigmatic as she reached for her purse. Perhaps it's time we had a different kind of conversation, Mrs. Margareth. One about who really supports whom in this family. Andrew's face drained of color. Isabella, please. But Isabella was done pleasing, done accommodating, done pretending. 7 years I've sat at this table and endured your contempt, she said quietly. 7 years I've watched you undermine me while living off my money. Tonight, that ends. Mrs. Margareth's perfectly manicured hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass. You're speaking nonsense. Andrew, control your wife. But Andrew remained frozen, watching as Isabella removed her phone from her purse and opened the banking app with deliberate precision. Shall we discuss who really pays for those diamonds around your neck, Mrs. Margareth? Or the staff who polished the silver we've eaten with tonight? Or perhaps... Isabella paused, her finger hovering above the screen, the very foundation this house stands upon. The chandelier light seemed to dim as a shadow of understanding, and fear crossed Mrs. Margareth's face. The dining room fell into a silence so absolute that Isabella could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, marking the seconds before Mrs. Margareth's perfect world would shatter. The crystal chandeliers cast dramatic shadows across faces frozen in a tableau of pending devastation. What exactly are you suggesting? Mrs. Margareth's voice had lost its melodic confidence, the slightest tremor betraying her growing unease. Isabella's fingers moved across her phone screen with deliberate precision. Each tap echoed in the silence, a countdown to revelation. I'm not suggesting anything, Isabella replied, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand. I'm about to show you what you've refused to see for 7 years. Andrew half rose from his chair, conflict etched across his handsome features. Isabella, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, Isabella cut him off, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Margareth's increasingly pale face. Your mother believes I'm some gold-digging parasite who latched onto you for financial security. She spent 7 years of family dinners insinuating I'm beneath you, that I'm unworthy, that I'm temporary. She turned her phone toward Mrs. Margareth, the screen illuminating the older woman's face with its damning evidence. Here are the direct transfers to your household account, dating back to our first year of marriage. Mrs. Margareth's eyes widened as she stared at the screen. Monthly transfers, each for an amount that would make most people gasp, labeled simply, family maintenance. A trust I established and fund completely, Isabella replied, swiping to show another screen. And here are the credit card statements, the ones you believe Andrew handles, showing payments for everything from your gardener to your personal shopper, to the very diamonds around your neck right now. Andrew slumped back into his chair, his face ashen. Isabella manages all our finances, he admitted, his voice barely audible. She always has. This is a mistake, Mrs. Margareth said, but her voice had lost its imperious edge. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled as she reached for her wine glass. The crystal glass slipped from Mrs. Margareth's fingers, spilling red wine like blood across the immaculate tablecloth. "Andrew," she whispered, turning to her son with desperation, "tell me this isn't true." But Andrew couldn't meet his mother's eyes. "Father left nothing, Mother. His gambling debts nearly took everything. Isabella saved us, saved you, from financial ruin." Mrs. Margareth's face crumpled, the carefully maintained facade of aristocratic superiority dissolving before their eyes. "But you told me you were handling everything, that you were following in your father's footsteps." "I lied," Andrew interrupted, his voice gaining strength as 7 years of complicity weighed on him. "I was too ashamed to tell you the truth, that my architectural firm barely breaks even, that Isabella's success has carried us all." Isabella watched the realization wash over her mother-in-law's face. Every snide comment about Isabella's career, every dismissive remark about working women, every implication that Isabella was the financial burden rather than the foundation that kept the Margareth family's illusion of wealth intact. "For 7 years," Isabella said softly, "I've watched you treat me like an interloper while living in a home I pay for, wearing jewels I purchased, and maintaining a lifestyle I finance. Not because I needed your approval, but because I love Andrew, and he loves you." She reached across the table, not in comfort but to reclaim her phone. "Every month, I transfer funds to maintain this charade. Every time you look down on me for working too much, you're benefiting from the very career you disdain." Mrs. Margareth's lips moved, but no sound emerged. The proud matriarch seemed to physically shrink in her chair, the realization of her dependency on the woman she'd tried to destroy, sweeping through her like a tsunami. "This is why you received that banking notification earlier," Isabella continued. "The monthly transfer just cleared. The one that will pay your staff, maintain this house, and keep up appearances for another 30 days. Andrew finally found his voice, reaching for Isabella's hand. "I should have told her years ago. I should have stood up for you." "Yes," Isabella agreed simply. "You should have." Mrs. Margareth pushed herself upright, desperate to regain control. This changes nothing. "A few financial arrangements don't erase the fact that you're still not right for this family. Money isn't everything." A bitter laugh escaped Isabella's lips. "How convenient that money doesn't matter now that you know where it comes from." "My son," Mrs. Margareth began. "Your son has been complicit in this deception," Isabella interrupted. "He allowed you to believe he was the provider because it suited his pride and your expectations. But the truth is, Mrs. Margareth," Isabella stood, smoothing her crimson dress with steady hands, "without me, there is no Margareth dynasty left to protect." Andrew stood beside her, finally choosing sides after 7 years of neutrality. "It's all true, Mother. Every word." Mrs. Margareth stared at her son as though seeing a stranger. "You would side with her, against your own mother?" "I'm siding with the truth," Andrew replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And the truth is, Isabella deserves your respect, not your contempt." The elegant dining room had transformed into a battleground of shattered illusions. Mrs. Margareth's face, usually a masterpiece of controlled emotion, now displayed the raw panic of someone watching their empire crumble beneath their feet. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the table as if it might anchor her to the reality she preferred, one where she, not Isabella, controlled the family's destiny. "This is absurd," Mrs. Margareth whispered, her voice gaining strength as denial surged through her veins. "A few bank statements prove nothing. My husband built this legacy." "Your husband gambled it away," Isabella corrected her, voice steady as a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis. The Margareth name remained, but the fortune disappeared 3 years before Andrew and I were married. Mrs. Margareth turned to her son, eyes pleading for the lifeline of a different truth. "Andrew, tell me you didn't let this woman take control of our family affairs. Your father would never. Father left us with nothing but debt and appearances. Andrew's voice cracked with the weight of years spent protecting his mother from reality. The investments failed, the properties were mortgaged, there were loans from people we don't speak about in polite company. Isabella watched her husband stand firm for perhaps the first time since she'd known him. The transformation was subtle, his shoulders squared, his jaw set, as 7 years of passive complicity began to fall away. Isabella saved us, he continued, gentle but unflinching. She restructured everything, paid off the dangerous debts, established the trusts that keep this house in our family name. Mrs. Margareth's breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling with the desperate tempo of a drowning woman. I don't believe it. I would have known. You chose not to know, Isabella interjected. The same way you chose not to acknowledge my place in this family. The same way you chose to treat me as temporary while living off the fruits of my labor. The crystal decanter caught the light as Mrs. Margareth reached for it with trembling fingers, pouring herself another glass of wine that sloshed dangerously close to the rim. She drank deeply, buying time, her mind visibly racing behind eyes that had lost their imperious gleam. This doesn't change anything, Mrs. Margareth declared, but the declaration rang hollow in the truth-filled room. Money comes and goes. Blood is permanent. Andrew is a Margareth and will always be a Margareth. Yes, he will, Isabella agreed. And I've protected the Margareth name from bankruptcy and scandal for 7 years while you treated me like an intruder. Mrs. Margareth's nostrils flared, a flash of the pride that had defined her life surging through her desperation. You think because you control the money, you control everything. Your son knew the truth all along, Isabella reminded her. He chose to let you believe what made you comfortable. Andrew placed his hand over Isabella's, a silent acknowledgement of his years of cowardice. I did this, Mother. I perpetuated the lie because I couldn't bear to tell you that Father left us with nothing but debt and a famous name. Mrs. Margareth's face contorted with a volatile mixture of rage and fear. So what now? You've had your dramatic revelation. You've humiliated me in my own home. Is that what you wanted? To see me brought low? No, Isabella answered simply. What I wanted, what I've always wanted, was your respect. Respect? Mrs. Margareth laughed, a brittle sound that threatened to shatter like the family's illusions. So you want me to respect the woman who holds my son's heritage hostage, who dangles financial security over our heads like some sword of Damocles? Andrew slammed his hand against the table, wine glasses trembling with the impact. She never held anything over us. She saved us, Mother. Without her, this house would belong to the bank. Your jewelry would be sold. Your staff dismissed. Your social position destroyed. The brutal truth hung in the air like the crystal chandelier above them. Beautiful, heavy, and potentially devastating if it fell. Mrs. Margareth gathered the tattered remains of her dignity around her like an invisible cloak. This doesn't mean anything. You may have put money here and there, but my son, he always took care of me. The desperate plea struck Andrew like a physical blow. He looked at his mother, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time seeing the frightened woman beneath the imperious facade. No, Mother, he said, his voice gentle but firm. It was always Isabella's money. I never paid for anything in this house. I never paid anything for you. The final illusion shattered. Mrs. Margareth's face crumpled, decades of certainty dissolving in an instant of unbearable truth. The elegant matriarch seemed to physically diminish, shrinking into her chair as the reality of her dependence on the woman she had scorned became undeniable. So what happens now? She whispered, looking suddenly older, vulnerable in a way Isabella had never witnessed. You've made your point. Will you cut me off? Throw me out of my home? Is that your revenge? Isabella studied the woman across the table, this adversary who had orchestrated 1,000 tiny cruelties, who had tried repeatedly to drive a wedge between her and Andrew, who had dismissed her accomplishments while secretly depending on them. That was never my intention, Isabella replied, her voice neither triumphant nor vindictive. Unlike you, Mrs. Margareth, I don't confuse family with possession. I don't use money as a weapon. She stood, smoothing her dress with steady hands. The power in the room had shifted, the current of authority flowing toward her not simply because of wealth, but because of truth, finally spoken aloud. The monthly transfers will continue, Isabella stated, her tone businesslike yet compassionate. Your lifestyle remains secure. But from this moment forward, we will build a relationship based on truth, or we will have no relationship at all. Mrs. Margareth remained silent, her empire of illusions now dust beneath Isabella's feet. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, marking not just the hour but the end of an era for the Margareth family. The dining room, with its opulent furnishings and exquisite artwork, seemed suddenly hollow, a beautiful shell emptied of the lies that had sustained it. Mrs. Margareth sat motionless, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer dress suddenly incongruous with the vulnerable woman beneath. The silence stretched between them like a vast ocean, impossible to cross with the small boats of polite conversation they had once employed. Andrew moved first, rising from his chair with the determined expression of a man awakening from a long sleep. I'll get your coat, Isabella. You're leaving. Mrs. Margareth's voice was small, stripped of its imperious command. For the first time in 7 years, she looked at Isabella not with contempt, but with fear, the primal fear of abandonment. Yes, Isabella replied simply. There's nothing more to say tonight. As Andrew left the room, the two women faced each other across the battlefield of crystal and silver. The truth hung between them, too massive to ignore, too transformative to dismiss. He will choose me in the end, Mrs. Margareth said. But the words lacked conviction. Blood is thicker than water. Isabella smiled, not unkindly. But truth is stronger than illusion. And love, real love, doesn't require deception to survive. Andrew returned with Isabella's coat, his movements deliberate, as though each step represented a choice long deferred. The weight of his silence spoke volumes as he helped Isabella into her coat with a tenderness that had been absent in their earlier interactions. You're going with her? Mrs. Margareth asked, disbelief coloring her words. Andrew turned to his mother, his expression complex, compassion intermingled with resolution. Isabella is my wife, my partner. For 7 years, I've stood between you both, trying to keep peace by allowing lies to flourish. That ends tonight. Mrs. Margareth's lips trembled. After everything I've sacrificed for you, everything she sacrificed for you, Andrew corrected gently. The truth may hurt, Mother, but continuing to live in falsehood would destroy us all. Isabella watched the exchange with a strange detachment, as though the years of tension had culminated in this moment of clarity. The victory she felt was not triumph over Mrs. Margareth, but liberation from the suffocating web of pretense they had all helped weave. What happens now? Mrs. Margareth whispered, her fingers tracing patterns on the damask tablecloth. Isabella stepped forward, her voice steady. That depends on you. The financial arrangements will continue. I'm not vindictive enough to dismantle your life over wounded pride, but respect must flow both ways from this point forward. Andrew moved to stand beside his wife, their unified front, a visual declaration of his choice. We need time, Mother. When you're ready to accept Isabella as my wife, truly accept her, we can begin rebuilding. Something shifted in Mrs. Margareth's expression, a hairline fracture in the porcelain mask she had worn for decades. And if I can't, then you will live very comfortably, Isabella replied, but very alone. The three of them stood suspended in this moment of truth, the paths of their future branching before them like veins of gold in stone, valuable but requiring effort to extract. Andrew took Isabella's hand and led her toward the door, each step resonating on the marble floor like a judge's gavel coming down. At the threshold, Isabella paused and turned back to Mrs. Margareth, who remained seated like a deposed queen at her former court. "Don't worry, Mrs. Margareth," Isabella said, her voice carrying across the silent room with perfect clarity. "I won't abandon you." "But without me, who will pay your bills?" The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving Mrs. Margareth alone with the echo of truth and the shattered pieces of her illusions scattered like the crystal drops of the chandelier above her head. Outside, the night air felt cleansing against Isabella's skin. Andrew stood beside the car, his face illuminated by the mansion's exterior lights, looking simultaneously exhausted and renewed. "I've been a coward," he said without preamble. "I let her treat you that way for 7 years. Isabella studied her husband's face, the face she had fallen in love with, the face that had remained silent through countless dinners of veiled insults and condescension. "Yes," she agreed, offering neither absolution nor condemnation, simply acknowledgement of truth. "You were." Andrew flinched at her honesty but nodded in acceptance. "Can you forgive me?" Isabella felt the weight of 7 years lift from her shoulders. The question wasn't whether she could forgive him. The question was, what would happen next? "The real question," she said, taking his hands in hers, "is what you're going to do now." Andrew looked back at the mansion where he had grown up, the beautiful prison of expectations and appearances that had shaped him. Then he turned to Isabella, his eyes clear with resolve for perhaps the first time in their marriage. "I'm going to be worthy of you," he said simply. "Starting tonight." Isabella felt something shift between them. Not the end of their story, but perhaps the beginning of a truer one. As they drove away from the mansion, she caught a glimpse of Mrs. Margareth's silhouette at the window, a solitary figure in a house built on illusions, but maintained by Isabella's truth. She despised me her entire life, Isabella thought, as the mansion receded in the rearview mirror. Now all she has left is to depend on the very thing she despised. What would you do if you were in Isabella's place? Would you have exposed the truth sooner, or waited like she did? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories like this.